Welcome to another edition of Inside the War Room. Ryan Ray here, as always, talking to you. Okay, let's get into it. First off, let me just apologize for this podcast a little bit because we had some technical difficulty. I don't know if it was my internet, his internet, the internet between. I have no idea, but it glitched out. So there might be one or two question or answers that are kind of cut funny. That's because that's just the way it turned out. But other than that, it should be fine. It was a fantastic interview. The second thing to apologize for is I had COVID last week. And so this interview and the Desmond Choom interview and maybe one other I recorded when I had COVID. So I did not feel well. But I try to power through. So hopefully it doesn't show up too bad. Today's topic is How China Loses. At least that's the name of the book by Luke Petey. A fantastic read. Go check it out. I'll be probably talking about it more on Twitter and LinkedIn. So if you want to follow along there, feel free to. Let's talk about Ryan Recommends. Ryan Recommends segment today is The Martian. I don't know if I recommended that or not, but I'm going to recommend it again. It's a good book. I've thought about the book a lot since I've read it. It's captivating in a lot of ways, and it's told from first person a lot, and that's very hard to pull off. And so I thought Andy Weir did a fantastic job of that. And the second thing is, when I had COVID, I watched a lot of movies. I went back and watched In the Line of Fire, Clint Eastwood classic. Go check that out. So those are my Ryan Recommends. I will drop those below in the show notes. Sponsor today is Bluehost. I said, I think last time, COVID brain, that all of my podcasts are hosted on Bluehost. That's not true. None of my podcasts are hosted by Bluehost. My domains, my websites, they're all hosted by Bluehost. $2.95 a month when you sign up using my promo code. We'll link that below. Go ahead and check that out. And if you do, here's the deal. Send me a screenshot of it, and I will personally read off your website or whatever it is that you're promoting via the Bluehost domain you purchase on this podcast. Okay. With that being said, final thing is, if you're looking to make money online or in real life, whatever it is, you need to be reading the 5 Wide newsletter. I break down how to do it, the tools, the tricks, the techniques, and it's entertaining. It's entertaining. So be sure to sign up for that. RyanRaySenior.com/5Wide. RyanRaySenior.com/5Wide. I'll link to all of that below. But now we're going to Luke Patey, who again has the book How China Loses. Here's something of interest. You look at this book, you go, wow, that's a thick book, but it is. I think roughly 100 pages of footnotes. So it's not like he just threw together some random, I can't do it right on the fly, but it's not like it's just some random hot takes. This is a well-researched book. He traveled all over the world, brings in a lot of experts, interviews, and anyways, be sure to read it. Books link below. Without further ado, here's my interview with Luke Patey. Well, Luke Petey, it is wonderful to get you on today. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on, Ryan.
Okay, well, with the book titled How China Loses, I have to get you on. Like, that's because all the headlines are is China's going to win. We'll always speak in Mandarin in 15 years, it feels like. And you come out of the book at least titled How China Loses. And so first, where did the title come from? Because it is a provocative title, if nothing else.
Yeah, I mean, the title came from sort of my my reaction to a lot of, I think, the hype about China and its global influence, and trying to sort of add some balance to the debate that China, that not everything China touches in the world turns to gold, that China is facing a lot of challenges in the different regions it's investing in, and a lot of its initiatives are facing headwinds. So that's where the title came from. It's not sort of a prophecy necessarily, but it's an effort to show that China is not unstoppable. All its ambitions will not necessarily be realized, particularly if other countries, particularly the U.S. and Western democracies, but also Asian democracies, India, Japan, Korea, and others, use their sort of collective weight and push back, negotiate with the Chinese in the WTO, form defensive cooperations like the Quad to deter China's military expansionism in Asia, and that there is a possibility that China's can be slowed down not that its developmental growth should be stopped for any reason, not that China should be contained in any way, but that China can be deterred, and that a greater defense can be built up among countries around the world.
Yeah, and in your conclusion, one of the things that you start out by saying is that the world cannot afford for China to lose. And for me, we're going to get into just kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly about China. But I think we had on R.R. Reno back a few episodes ago, and he talks about this kind of coming out of the World War II mindset and how we're kind of always looking for Nazi Germany everywhere across the world, and we're not really there anymore. And I think that's important to think about when you think about China is that China losing, if you will, depending on what you mean by that term, but broadly, if they were to collapse as a society, that'd be devastating for the global economy. That'd be devastating for Americans, Australians, all the places we're talking about today. So when we say win or lose, we can define those terms in a second, but broadly speaking, a collapse would not be good for anyone.
No, and I don't think China is necessarily headed in that direction. I mean, China is here to stay. I mean, China is a superpower. It's definitely an economic superpower already. It's a military power. It has greater cultural influence than it did before. So China is going to be sticking around for some time as a significant power in the world. And you hit the nail on the head. I mean, if China does face an economic crisis, if it does face a political crisis in the near future, we're all in trouble. We need China. China's population, 1.3 billion. Its economy is edging towards 20% of the global economy. So China is necessary to overcome global challenges like the current COVID pandemic, of course, addressing climate change. So China losing, or China failing to reach modernization, China somehow coming into instability would be a bad deal for most of us. If relations with the U.S. and China, for example, continue to be on a negative level, if they degenerate, we're all in trouble, regardless of where we are. The same can be said with China and India. These two Asian giants need to get along as well for us to take on these global challenges. So yeah, China's importance is I think going to be a permanent fixture in international relations for quite some time to come.
Yeah, real quick, let me just push back slightly on the military angle. You do see that more because of what they're doing. I'm not a military guru, so when I hear some of the military people, the experts talk, and some of the weapons that they sold internationally, I'm not entirely convinced that their military is that capable. So another thing is, I'm not entirely convinced that China taking military action like invading Taiwan is possible. Okay, it's possible. I'm not sure they would do it. Do you believe in the military might thing, or is that a little bit overhyped, or what's kind of your read on that? Because they have the numbers, but I don't know. To me, it seems it's more propaganda than actual substance.
It's not something I go into great depth in the book, but China's military has modernized quite significantly compared to where it used to be. Its reach in Asia, for example, has expanded. I think its ability to defend itself and to deter others from any invasion is much stronger than it used to be. It now has a military base in Djibouti. After years of saying it would never have these foreign outposts. And of course, everyone's in Djibouti, the US, Japan, different EU countries. But that gives China sort of this more global reach. And we're seeing them put it to use in joint operations with the Russians, in even as far as the Baltic Sea. So, I agree that China's military is still in a modernization period, but it's definitely becoming its presence is definitely being felt more, particularly in Asia and more around the world as well.
Okay, I want to get into some more specific stuff here in a second, but I do have a question that I think about a lot. And when the China economic numbers come out or whatever, you always have the person, and sometimes it's me, on Twitter going, China lies about all its numbers. You can't believe it. And there is something to the fact that we have to remember that China puts out an ungodly amount of propaganda. Some of the things they say is true. How do you cut through trying to decipher what's true or false? And I'll give you one example to me that I thought China was being honest about that some people didn't take them seriously. A few months ago, they released their demographic numbers, and it was like well below. It was dangerously low replacement level. And some people are like, "Oh, they're lying about that." I'm like, I don't think they're lying about that in this context, because if you actually think about the implications, they're catastrophic, 40, 60 years down the road. It's a problem. And then within a month or so, they had the 3-child policy. So to me, that kind of made sense. Like they were telling the truth about this and this. But there's plenty of times I'm like, okay, is this true? Is this propaganda? So for our listeners, how does an expert like yourself try to cut through the propaganda and understand what is true and what is not?
I mean, you got to go to the ground. You got to cross-check sources. And I mean, at least in my own focus on China's international affairs, what you say definitely holds true, right? If you think about their big sort of infrastructure, trade, technology plan, the Belt and Road Initiative, it's often hyped as sort of a $1 trillion plan, and that this money will be rolled out over the next several decades. But if you go down to the ground level and you start counting projects, as researchers have been doing, and trying to sort of ascertain how much is actually being spent, it's been several $100 billion by most estimates. That's a significant amount, but it's not something that is sort of overwhelming the international landscape. Even, for example, in Southeast Asia, which is commonly known as China's backyard these days, there Japan still outspends the Chinese where infrastructure finance is concerned. That's not only historically, but also planned projects moving forward. Japan is in the lead. If you look at Latin America or Africa, the Chinese are have spent sort of over 100 billion, around 150 in each continent. But the World Bank and other sort of multilateral banks have been matching that. They spend on different things, but they've been sort of at around the same level. So China's not sort of overwhelming everyone else, but it's done an incredible marketing job behind the Belt and Road, behind its own economy as well, right? China's, I think its share of the global economy, as I said, was sort of edging towards 20%. Mm-hmm. But by 2050, it should sort of top out around 25%. The US will still be close to 20%. India will be rising above 15%. So this isn't sort of a scenario, like a post-World War II scenario where China's economy is just similar to the US, where China's economy is just so large that it's sucking in everyone else, right? We have to take sort of, as you say, these projections into the future with a grain of salt. So many things need to happen, right? Reforms need to take place. It needs to attract foreign investment for it to get to that point as well. So, I mean, yeah, I tend to agree that we need to be cautious when there isn't sort of many checks on those figures within China.
So my first exposure to someone who had a tangible experience with the Belt and Road, if you want, I was a friend of mine who were in China, actually. He was talking about what China was doing in Colombia and Venezuela. And he was very, very upset with all that they were doing, and what he felt like was very unfair business practices. Obviously, Venezuela is not known for free market capitalism, so you can kind of see corruption there. And in the book, you talk about Argentina and kind of what's going on down there. I don't think, when you think China, you may think Southeast Asia, you might think Africa. Eric Olander with the China Africa Project, but you don't think South America a lot. But they have a presence down there, and it was kind of surprising hearing from him. It was also kind of good to see your kind of coverage of the book. Maybe unpack what all is going on down there, and then one final thing I'll mention is for the listeners to go check out is you can go read. Earlier this year, a few months ago, there were some conversations between China and Brazil over vaccines and trade and stuff. And so their teeth are probably more sunk in to South America than maybe most people who don't follow this realize.
Yeah, I mean, China's expanded their presence in South America for the last sort of 2 decades, very similar to Africa in many respects. And when I started the book, I came from an Africa studies background and was looking at Sudan and South Sudan, but then wanted to look more at Latin America and went to Argentina. And there are a lot of a lot of parallels between Latin America and Africa, where China's engagement is concerned. Latin America primarily serves as sort of a source for raw materials for China's economy. So, from oil from Venezuela, iron ore from Brazil, and soybeans from Argentina. These are sort of the fuels that are necessary for China's domestic growth, for its own agricultural industry, for its energy sector, and the vast majority of China's exports from Latin America, or at least the majority, come from natural resources, and that's one similarity to Africa, that despite all the activities China has in Africa and Latin America, it's still mostly buying raw materials from both continents. The other, I think, striking similarity between the two and is China's activities in construction and infrastructure and energy on the continent in Latin America. I think they've provided around $140 billion in finance since the early 2000s, much of that into sort of transport and energy infrastructure, railroads, hydropower dams, nuclear power plants. So they've expanded their presence through finance as well. And we've seen since I think around 2019, this really sharply went down, right? Belt and Road finance, by and large, over the last couple of years has fallen, even before the COVID pandemic took hold. And even in 2020, there was zero finance, official finance from China's policy banks offered to Latin America. And this might be because they're investing more, right? They're making some more foreign investments. They might be providing finance directly to Chinese state-owned enterprises, but there's definitely a drop in that engagement. So the other, I think, interesting thing about Latin America that seldom gets coverage with China is that China really, as I mentioned, is really only buying the natural resources. Only 3% of Latin America's exports to China are manufactured goods. So there's also this competitiveness, in a sense, between Latin America and China in terms of low-cost manufacturing. That's a lot of it's still taking place in China, and Latin American, countries like Mexico or Brazil or Colombia that were, in terms of servicing the American market in particular with clothing and apparel and footwear, China has been their major competitor when it comes to that. If you think from sort of the 1980s and 90s on, and this connects to job growth and whatnot across the Latin American continent. So there are some trouble spots in the Latin America-China relationship, including on social and environmental issues, on how these companies are investing. But yeah, it's along with Africa, Latin America is really one of the main regions in the world where China's presence has grown quite significantly.
Yeah, that was his big complaint, was that they were taking these raw materials, exporting them to China, and then China was refining them and selling them back at a relatively nice markup to the people of Colombia or Venezuela or to wherever. And it's like, well, hold on, wait, we lost that. You took it, then you sold it back to us. And this partly one of the things I tried to emphasize to him and to our international listeners is one of the ways to solve this problem is to do what the U.S. does, which is to allow landowners to own the minerals, which would fix some of this problem. And every country in the world, to my knowledge, other than the U.S., the state owns the minerals, which means that you can strike these deals with China, and it's very, very much one-sided. That's a conversation for another day. But when you look at these countries, like a Venezuela, like a Colombia, and I have some dealings in West Africa. They are struggling to climb up the economic ladder. They are fighting tooth and nail. There's all kinds of internal problems, and then you bring the aid in, and the aid, historically speaking, whether it's from the U.S., whether it's from the Europeans, or whether it's from the Chinese, it's done a poor job of actually accomplishing what it's supposed to accomplish. And so, part of the question that I always struggle with is, you talk about the Belt and Road and China's expansion and all this stuff. It's like, okay, I think China's doing some things right. We'll talk about that in a second. But the other thing is there's a lot of frustration because these are huge problems that you're trying to tackle, and throwing money at it, exporting your labor to other countries, in some cases what China seems to be doing, isn't necessarily the most beneficial way. And I'm not entirely sure at the time in history that China's entered the game, it will work out well for them because a lot of these countries have been, raped and pillaged, if you will, for so long that they're kind of at the end of the rope dealing with stuff like this. What's your read on, how long these bad deals, if you will, can go on? Not just with China, just in general.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of China's sort of reputation is on the line, I think, in the long term with a lot of these infrastructure deals, right? If China in the next sort of 5, 10, 15 years starts to see a lot of white elephants materialize in developing countries in Latin America and Africa and developing Asia, that's going to really take a major hit against the Belt and Road's reputation. We've already seen, a more cautious approach to the Belt and Road because of the fear of becoming sort of over indebted, not necessarily to China, but countries in general are worried about high debt levels. So, I mean, a lot is going to be, I think, decided in the next, 5 to 15 years. But if these projects do succeed in sort of building development growth, that will be a boon for China. I mean, I have my doubts, firstly, because, something around 80-90% of the projects in the Belt and Road tend to be constructed and often operated by Chinese companies. And this from the get-go, right? It crowds out local industry and doesn't give them an opportunity to grow. And you see some of the deals that have been renegotiated, for instance, in Argentina, in Malaysia, the political leadership has made sure that local private sector gets more involved. But still, China is usually dominating those deals. Secondly, infrastructure alone is not, going to produce development. Just because you build a road or a hydropower dam, that doesn't mean that there's businesses to use that infrastructure. They also need to be built up in many countries. And China's own experience, with infrastructure is not necessarily, the way to go for others. And Chinese economists have also, berated the Chinese political leadership on selling sort of the wrong model of China's economic growth, of not sort of underlining the influence of the private sector, of entrepreneurs, of foreign investment in China's own development growth. It wasn't just about building a lot of infrastructure. It was also about those other factors. And thirdly, China has basically, there's this hope, at least in many developing countries, including in Africa and Latin America, that there will be this massive offshoring of jobs from China as costs rise in the Chinese economy and sort of low value manufacturing becomes too expensive for Chinese and other foreign companies, that they will sort of offshore these jobs elsewhere in the world. That's happening to a certain degree, but most of those jobs are going to Southeast Asia and South Asia, close by to the Chinese mainland, close to the Chinese market. Not a lot is flowing into Africa and Latin America. There's not this promise really isn't being kept, that different economists said would sort of take place, that there'd be this huge migration of jobs for Africans and others in the developing world. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's going to be winners and losers in ultimately. Some countries that have sort of a very sort of deliberate strategy, like Ethiopia, for example, may have some successes. But that's not, that still leaves, more than another 50 or more African countries left to that aren't going to get that same level of support. So it's not going to be sort of development for everyone.
Yeah, and I wonder how much, and I try to compare stuff to the 50s and 60s just because it's a relatively near time frame. But I wasn't alive then, but we all know someone who was alive then, and we can understand the differences. And so, expansion in the 50s and 60s in whether it's Africa or Central America, it was very much the narrative was very much controlled, right? So it was very much top down through the local newspaper, radio, the government officials, whatever it was very limited, very much top down. Now you can get on the internet and you can read what Xi Jinping's saying from Kenya, Ethiopia, Venezuela, whatever, and you can read what they're saying. You can read what your government saying. You can find a dissenting voice, and so I do think that China, part of the problem they're going to have to face is that if you talk to people they're frustrated with some of their quality, and some of these projects aren't going through. That the propaganda, while it's there, you can also find a lot more people critiquing China's policies. Whereas in the 50s and 60s, it was just different. You just couldn't communicate with the world. So I do think that they're going to face a different world, just like we all are, where the propaganda, while it's there, is going to be challenged. And once you get outside of the great firewall, if you will, China can't control the narrative. And we've seen them try to do that with some countries, trying to say, hey, we've got to control the narrative, but it doesn't seem to be effective.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, the most, I think, strongest case for that is Sri Lanka, and this sort of debt trap diplomacy debate that was brought up from its experience with China. And I'm not a proponent of the debt trap theory. I mean, I don't think the intention is necessarily there on the Chinese side to sort of over-indebt smaller countries in order to capture strategic assets when these countries can't pay back. But nonetheless, this happened in Sri Lanka in one way or another, that the Sri Lankan government needed to sell off equity in this port, and the Chinese company bought it, and then that handed basically the Americans and others who want to sort of paint the BRI in a negative light, a big nice low hanging fruit to bash this initiative, and that sort of had a domino effect. When the Malaysians renegotiated some of their deals a few years after that, they pointed to the Sri Lankan cases as a path they didn't want to follow, and that that has been seen in other places too. Myanmar, Pakistan, countries that are still taking Chinese finance, of course, but have been sort of downsizing their ambitions because of this fear of becoming over indebted. So yeah, the Belt and Road, with all its promises, with all its propaganda, also opens up for a lot of criticism, and China can't control all these international debates at the same time. So it's going to have to show development results as well, and that we'll see down the road.
So you mentioned the debt trap diplomacy. One of the things that I've thought about is, will there be a point where enough, let's take Africa maybe, because there's more concentration of nations there, enough African nations are like, you know what, we're just not gonna pay back and come do something about it, more or less. Like there's a civil uprising that you have the people like, we're not gonna pay you back, come do something about it. And China's kind of stuck with, they either have to go do something, which would cause all kinds of problems, or they've got to do debt relief. And could that take a blow to the ego, to the prestige? Because I just believe that we're just at a different spot. Do you think we could see a situation like that where there's a handful of African nations like, you know what, we don't like the deal. We feel like you guys have been dishonest with us. You sold us bad COVID vaccines or bad ports or bad whatever. We're just not going to pay you back. Come do something about it. Because I actually think that's where you could see at least some of the shine knocked off of the Chinese foreign policy.
Yeah, I mean, right now, countries that are really indebted to China, maybe it's sort of 15-20% of their external debt. China's been fairly, it's open to negotiating sort of a moratorium on paying back debt. So we haven't seen those examples come up yet, that countries just sort of abandon ship, or sort of a new government comes in and says, we're not paying this back. Sorry, that was the old government. And I think still at this stage, in China's favor, that people are going to be very cautious saying that, because if you're a developing country, I don't think you want to be in China's orbit completely, but you don't want to be sort of so far away from it that you can't sort of access some of the benefits that might come from that arrangement. So if you're a typical developing country in Asia, you want to work with the Americans, you want to work with the Indians, you want to work with the Chinese. And you want to keep all those avenues open. We saw this in, I think it was Mauritius, where, a new government came in. We saw it in Malaysia as well. The new government, very critical of China at first, but, downsized some deals, even canceled some due to corruption, but didn't sort of burn bridges. But that's, goes to my point as well, that, we're in a multipolar world. And if you're a developing country or emerging economy, you want to play with all the big boys, and China's just one of them. They're not going to dominate many of these countries.
Well, that's a fair point. And the other thing to think about is, I wrote something last year right in the height of the pandemic back in May, talking about the fact that China would roll out, debt, not necessarily relief and debt moratoriums because like that's what they had to do, and they did. And so they do play the debt game pretty well from my perspective, at least the PR. Like, hey, we're gonna push the loans back. We can't do relief, or maybe we can do a little bit of relief. And they're always doing a good job on at least the externalities of the debt. And so okay, the key to that though, I think, and I'm curious your thoughts because for me, the EU I think holds a bigger place in this discussion than maybe the American side wants to give credit to. And if you go back to last year, there was an article somewhere that Xi Jinping hadn't talked to Trump but one time, but he talked to Merkel like 4 times because Germany was about to be the president of the EU. And so the Western media, at least in the U.S., is like, well, China doesn't care what the world thinks, and they're always internalized. And it seems like their actions would contradict that. And the fact that they were working on Germany so hard before they took over was it 6 months or year-long rating of the EU, kind of led to that as well. I think the EU really is kind of the focal point here because if the EU wants to take a strong stance against China, China's really in trouble. If the EU wants to work with China, and I'm not taking a side on what they should do, but I'm saying if they just want to kind of placate China, then China's okay. The U.S. alone, I don't think can really sway what China's going to do too much. I think the Trump administration proved that. What's your read on the EU and how much power they actually have in this with China?
That's a good question. I mean, things are under development, I think, with the EU, and they've been sort of in flux the last sort of, I'd say, 5 to 7 years where China's concerned, and it came sort of at different turning points. One of them being sort of in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, Chinese foreign investment in the EU has been ramping up. And at first, I think many European countries welcomed that, but then come around, I think 2016, 17, the numbers were increasing even more. And people here were noticing that these weren't sort of investments into new factories or service outlets of Chinese companies around Europe. These were takeovers. These were acquisitions of European companies. And that set off alarm bells in Brussels, in Berlin, in Paris. And we saw this new European strategic outlook come out in March 2019 that basically, painted China as a partner, yes, in trade and climate, but also as a strategic competitor and also as a systemic rival. So this is sort of how Europe wants to play this, right? It wants to sort of get as many benefits out of China as it can, but it wants to sort of also keep it at bay. And that latter part is quite new. So you have this sort of new investment screening passed by the European Union, but also new national restrictions on foreign investment by different EU countries, including Germany, that have been blocking Chinese investments into tech companies here in Europe in the last couple of years. You have new sort of anti-subsidy legislation in the works, trying to sort of undermine some of the competitive advantages that Chinese companies have when coming into the EU. You even have sort of an anti-coercion policy under discussion within the EU now to try to sort of deter China from coercing European member states. So you have sort of a more critical view that's grown in Europe, but still, as you note, there's still a lot of China proponents of improving relations with China, and proponents of how it used to be, wanting to keep that time alive. And those mostly are in Germany. Germany represents 40-50% of trade between the EU and China. It doesn't mean that the Germans are dependent on the Chinese economy. 7% of their trade is with China, and the US, France, Netherlands are close behind. So Germany has a very diverse trade portfolio, but there are a handful of German companies, Volkswagen, Daimler, the car makers in particular, BASF, this chemical giant, that have a higher sort of dependence on China. 15-20% of their sales are in the Chinese market. And of course, unlike all the small and medium-sized enterprises and companies in Germany, the big companies have the ear of the chancellor, and they can influence foreign policy and economic policy much greater than sort of the smaller companies can on their own. So you are seeing this sort of corporate influence and those interests coming through in Germany's policy, and that has a way of steering the EU away from a more critical approach on China. But yeah, the EU should not be forgotten, I think, by the US. That there are critical voices growing towards China, but there are still those sort of stronger voices that just want to continue the business opportunities to keep those things alive with China, and that don't put sort of much foresight into, where are these German companies going to be in 10, 15 years when their Chinese competitors grow, right? Was it worth it? All the gains in the short term, were they worth it if you lose your competitiveness in the long run? But I think Europe is going through this learning process right now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that Germany, there was reports last year that not necessarily the big companies you named, but kind of that next tier down was going to the leadership like, hey, they're out competing us, and not in China, but outside there. In what you kind of, if you peeled the onion back, you realize that these companies went to China. They had some kind of JV structure or whatever it is, and there was some kind of swap of intellectual property, whether it was theft or mutual or whatever. But now the Chinese were exporting that globally, and they were beating them at their own game. And the German companies were very much complaining. And to me, when I read those stories, whether it's a U.S. company or a China company, I don't have a lot of sympathy for them, because they knew what they were getting into on the front end. It's the average consumer who hears about it is like, oh, wow, man, China's screwing them guys over. It's like, well, they knew the risk they were taking. They just thought they could play it better than China could, and they got burned. And then you have that pressure coming on the government, and then you have the average consumer who needs the cheap goods from China. Like, well, hold on, I've got mixed loyalties here, because I don't want the Chinese, if for the perception at least, doing something wrong, but also I need my cheap goods because that's how I stay somewhat above the poverty line. And so it puts the average citizen in a bad spot. So I'm kind of torn on how to message that, but I'm quick to criticize the companies because it seems they knew what they were doing, and the average citizen is just kind of a victim of the game, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, it comes a lot to, I think, short-term thinking and just sort of the nature of a modern multinational corporation, that you got to think at the managerial level or the executive level, right? I want my bonus. I want to get quarter sales up. China is a big part of that growth. I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want my government to rock the boat. And I don't have the luxury of thinking where we might be in 10 years. Because I want to get my own career on the move right now, and I think there's nonetheless a growing sense in different companies, especially after we see the telecom industry get burned, and that was Ericsson and Nokia, two European companies that have been sort of pushed out of the Chinese market. We saw the railroad industry get burned. That's companies like Siemens and Alstom, also European companies that didn't sort of capitalize on the railroad industry's development in China as they hoped. We saw it with solar. German companies were huge sort of 10 years ago. Now the Chinese have sort of mopped the deck with them. And increasingly we're seeing it in the other big green industry, wind, and Vestas here in Denmark, where I am, and Siemens Gamesa, this German-Spanish company that compete with GE in the US, three big turbine makers. They're starting to feel more pressure from Chinese companies like Goldwind and Envision, not only in China, where those Chinese companies already dominate, but now in third markets as well. So you wonder, how many times does this need to happen before European policymakers and European executives say, okay, we need to have a different plan. We need to get together with the Japanese, with the Americans, with the Koreans, with the Canadians, and really try to get China to negotiate some new WTO rules, even if it might take years on end. It's going to be worth it down the road. And I think we're starting to see some of this thinking materialize. But the question is, can it happen quick enough to save some of these industries from this competitiveness?
Okay, so let's talk about some questions about the book, but not the book per se. The book is, again, How China Loses. So what was the one or two things maybe you thought going into writing the project, okay, this is what I believe about China, and that you changed your mind, maybe you moved a little bit, you wanted to reshape it? What are something like that through the process of writing this book that you really kind of learned or recast, would want to recast?
The one sort of myth I wanted to sort of break down was that the U.S. and China are the only two that matter for global affairs. The second one was this idea that China is sort of in a struggle versus the West alone. I think, if you look at China's neighbors, significantly India in particular, China also has troubles with countries that very much consider themselves outside of the West, and not part of the West. And that this includes other Asian countries as well that might be sort of have alliances with the U.S., of course, Japan and Korea. But China's sort of relationship with its neighbors is not sort of hunky-dory either. That we shouldn't talk about sort of this China versus U.S. or China versus the West, because it is more complex. And there are, I think, partners for the United States, partners for Europe within Asia, that don't want to break off relations with the Chinese, but do want to work with others that want to have sort of a WTO system that functions, that have clear trading rules and a deterrence against Chinese military expansion in the region.
Tell us your favorite story of traveling to cover this book, because you kind of went a bunch of places, so maybe not in the book, but it's something that you saw, you experienced, something that you enjoyed, because obviously you put I was looking, there's over 100 pages of index and footnotes and stuff like this. You did a lot of research, so give us, I know that has to be the tough work, give us some of the fun stuff in writing the book.
No, I mean, this is, it's such a privilege to have sort of the luxury to write a book and to travel, to do this, and the support to do that. So I mean, I really got to see the world by doing this book. Traveling from Africa, where I'd been working for years, and then going to Argentina, and getting sort of, the effort here was to really get in depth, to do an in-depth study in each of these countries, and to show how that reflected the sort of the broader relationship with China in these regions. And it was more sort of seeing the similarities between places, sort of some of this civil society resistance that, again, sort of a Chinese infrastructure project that was both happening in Argentina, but also in East Africa. And it was about also sort of seeing this development of Chinese officials that I met, because this was a project that took some years, and it sort of happened during the birth of China's wolf warrior diplomacy, sort of China's assertive foreign policy. So, I went from sort of a period where it was very hard to get hold of Chinese diplomats and officials and executives in the countries I was in Africa, to later, them being very outgoing, but also outspoken in their discussion with me, and sort of dictating sort of how they wanted things to function. And that all happened sort of in the 3 or 4 year period that I was really researching this book.
Okay. Anything that you left out of the book that after you kind of compiling it, because again, you've done a ton of research. So is there anything that you left out, you go, oh man, now in hindsight, I wish I would have put that in there, or maybe a project for a future book?
Yeah, I think the Middle East is needs to come in. It's a place that I wanted to get to look at China's presence and influence there, and sort of the shift from the U.S. being the main market for a lot of the Gulf oil producers, and now it being China. I also wanted to go more in depth into the relationship with India, because I think this relationship, China-India, is going to be significant for everyone. And to get to India, where I had traveled before for my last book, would have been sort of, I think, also ideal. And that's probably going to come into my future work as well.
Yeah, especially after the border kerfuffles that we've seen over the past year with India. I think that's going to be an interesting story to watch. Okay. Final question for the day. Besides your book on China, what other book would you recommend?
Oh, good question. There's so many good books coming out right now. I think, though, something that really sort of inspired me, at least, was Howard French's book, Everything Under Heaven, that he wrote some years back, that really showed this sort of ambition that China does have, that it does want to have power and influence in Asia and more increasingly globally as well.
You recommend that one? I'll link to that in the show notes, and I will recommend the new one by Peter Martin, China's Civilian Army, which I think is a fascinating look. And from my perspective, when you see kind of China doing some things, it's kind of like our U.S. foreign policy. That's some of the stuff that we've done before. It's just repackaged and looks different. So I think that's a good read. Okay, so folks, go pick up a copy of How China Loses. You can get it on Amazon. Audiobook as well if you like to listen to them. It's all over the place. We will link to that below in the show notes. Luke, thank you so much for your time. And listeners, we'll be back. Let's see, this comes out Thursday. So back next week.
Thanks very much, Ryan.